Dust clung to her boots as she stepped through the alley behind the mercantile. Mara kept her eyes low, her hands close to her chest, and her breath shallow. She had learned long ago that asking for kindness in the town of Dry Hollow was like asking the wind to hold still. It didn't matter that her husband was gone. It didn't matter that she scrubbed laundry and swept floors for pennies. People remembered what they wanted to remember, and they had chosen to remember her as unworthy. Behind the mercantile, a box sat half open, filled with crusted ends of bread, crumbled biscuits, and a sliver of cheese wrapped in old paper. The clerk didn't even look her way anymore. They all knew she'd come. She took only what she needed, she always did, but this time someone was watching. Across the street, Thomas Hale leaned in the doorway of his bakery, apron dusted with flour, arms crossed. He saw her. He had seen her before, not just the small figure darting behind shops and buildings, but really seen her. Her shoulders too thin beneath a threadbare shawl, her hands careful not to drop a crumb, her eyes hollow, but still alert. And he hated what he saw most, that no one else seemed to care. The bell above the bakery door jingled the next morning. Mara stepped inside hesitantly, arms tucked tight around herself. "I'm not here for a handout," she said quickly, before he could speak. "Just wondering if you had old bread for sale. Maybe something, not too fresh." Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth and nodded toward the counter. "I have loaves from yesterday. Still good. Better than what they left you behind the mercantile." Her eyes flashed, defensive. "You been watching me?" "Not in the way you think," he said gently. "I just don't think you deserve crumbs." Mara's voice softened. "What do you think I deserve then?" He didn't answer right away. He reached beneath the counter and placed a fresh loaf, warm and fragrant, into a paper wrap. He slid it toward her. "Start with this," he said, "and we'll figure the rest out later." Mara left without saying thank you, but as she stepped into the sun, her fingers tightened around the still warm loaf like it might break. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't eat in the shadows. She sat by the well in the center of town and ate slowly, bite by bite, because someone had looked her in the eye and fed her like she mattered. Thomas Hale wasn't used to company. His bakery had always been more of a refuge than a business. He baked before sunrise, served a few townsfolk in the morning rush, and then spent the rest of his day alone, kneading, slicing, tending the fire, tending the silence. But that week everything changed, because every morning, just as the first batch of loaves cooled on the counter, she came. Mara didn't speak much, just nodded, sometimes placed a coin on the counter, sometimes not. And Thomas didn't ask. Instead, he always had something waiting. Bread, a biscuit, once even a tiny apple tart. It was the only way he knew how to speak. Through flour, through warmth, through kindness that didn't expect anything in return. One morning, the silence between them cracked. "You ever wonder what people are really hungry for?" Mara asked, her voice barely above the sound of the dough being kneaded. Thomas looked up from the bench. "You mean besides bread?" She nodded. "Not just food, but being seen, being spoken to like you're not shame." Thomas leaned back. "I used to think it was just about surviving, but now..." "Now?" "Now I think most folks are starving for softness." Mara stared at him a moment longer than she should have, then looked away. That afternoon, someone knocked at the bakery's back door. When Thomas opened it, he found a boy, no older than 12, holding a torn paper note. "She sent this," he said. Thomas opened the note. It was simple, almost awkwardly written. "I made soup. I figured bread needs something to sit beside." He smiled. He told the boy, "Come back in 10 minutes." When he arrived at her doorstep, Mara looked surprised. She opened the door halfway, soup pot in hand. "I didn't mean you had to come all the way over." "I don't mind," Thomas said. "I didn't want your soup traveling alone." She chuckled. "Bread's company now?" "Only the good kind." They sat outside on the stoop, shared soup and bread while the sun dipped behind the low hills. No one else passed. No one noticed. And for the first time in a very long while, Mara smiled without lowering her gaze. Not because he made her laugh, not because he said the right things, but because he stayed. And in a town full of closed doors, that was more nourishing than anything else. By the end of the second week, it wasn't just the smell of bread that brought Mara to the bakery. It was the sound of Thomas humming softly as he worked, the quiet nod he gave her when she stepped through the door, and the way he always had a chair pulled out near the back window, like he hoped she'd stay but didn't dare ask. At first, she only came for the food. But now, she came because it was the one place where no one whispered when she entered. One morning, she helped sweep the bakery floor. Thomas had been out back, tending the fire, and when he returned, he found her with a broom in one hand and a smudge of flour on her cheek. "You know," he said, "you keep doing that, and folks'll think you work here." She looked up. Maybe I'd like that. He blinked, surprised by her boldness, and then smiled. You'd be overqualified. You don't burn things. She laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A real full laugh that shook the dust from the walls. And Thomas decided right then it was the best sound he'd ever heard in that bakery. But not everyone in town liked what they saw. Whispers began, low and sharp. He's letting her in the back now? She's just taking advantage, same as she always did. Poor Thomas. Doesn't know what he's getting into. Mara noticed it first. The sideways glances, the hesitations. She stopped coming for 2 days. On the third morning, Thomas found a small cloth bundle on his back step. Inside was half a loaf of his own bread, slightly burned. A note attached said only, "Trying to learn without bothering you. I understand if the bakery is yours alone." Thomas stared at the note until the fire in his oven nearly burned the biscuits. Then he threw on his coat and walked straight to her door. Mara opened it slowly, surprised to see him. "I thought you might need space," she said quietly. "Bread rises better when it's warm," he replied. She blinked. "What?" He stepped closer. "And so do people, Mara." He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't need to. Because by the next morning she was already there, dusting the shelves, brushing the flour off her dress, smiling just a little. "And Thomas?" He gave her an apron. Not as a favor, but as a start. Word spread quickly in Dry Hollow. Not just that Mara was working at the bakery now, but that Thomas Hale, the quiet widower who barely spoke 10 words to anyone in a day, was smiling more. And that smile, to some people, was an offense, especially to Mrs. Whitley. She ran the church luncheons and whispered prayers over those she didn't trust. She'd always eyed Mara like a stain on the edge of a clean cloth. And now seeing her handing out warm loaves to townsfolk from behind Thomas Hale's counter, unforgivable. "She's just looking for a husband to pay her bills," Mrs. Whitley hissed to the general store clerk. "It's the same as when she married Robert. Sweet smile, empty pockets. Mark my words." It didn't matter that Mara had scrubbed floors at the boarding house for a year. Didn't matter that she never once asked for help. All they saw was the past. All they heard were old rumors. One afternoon, Thomas returned from delivering bread to the livery and found Mara standing stiffly at the counter, her cheeks red, her eyes distant. "What happened?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "Mrs. Whitley came in. Didn't buy anything. Just reminded me who I used to be." Thomas didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He walked to the window, stared out for a moment, then said, "You ever notice how bread never asks who made it?" Mara tilted her head. "What?" "Doesn't matter if it's a baker, a girl with dirt on her knees, or someone everyone doubts. If it rises, if it's warm, if it feeds people, it's good bread." She smiled faintly. "You're comparing me to bread again. I only compare things to what I respect." That night, Mara found a package on her doorstep. Inside was a perfectly wrapped loaf with a card. "You're not who you used to be. And even then, you didn't deserve crumbs. Signed, T." She clutched it to her chest. Not because of the bread, but because someone saw her as more than a story others had written. The next morning, Mara wore her apron like armor. She opened the shop before Thomas arrived. She had flour on her sleeves, dough under her nails, and a quiet fire in her chest. She wasn't just helping at the bakery now. She belonged to it, and slowly she was starting to believe she deserved to. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Flour at dawn, dough by 7, loaves cooling by 9, and Mara, standing at the counter, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back, eyes steady, looked more and more like someone who had always belonged in that space. For the first time in years, her hands weren't just working to survive, they were creating. And Thomas? He was still quiet, still careful. But something was shifting between them, something neither of them dared name yet. One evening, after the bakery had closed and the town's clamor faded into distant night sounds, Thomas lingered behind as Mara finished wiping down the tables. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The noise, the crowds, the way things were before." Mara leaned her hip against the flour barrel. "Before what? Before my husband died and people turned cold? Before I was handed stale bread like it was a blessing?" She paused, softened. "No, I don't miss any of that." Thomas nodded, lips pressed. "I meant more like before life made everything feel like a transaction." Mara's eyes flicked to him. "You think that's what this is? A transaction?" He stepped closer. "No, that's exactly what I don't think." The air between them quieted. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and the creak of wood cooling for the night. Then Thomas said, "I never brought you bread to earn anything. I gave it because it felt wrong not to." Mara looked down at her flour-covered hands. "And I stayed because it was the first time someone fed me without reminding me what I owed." Their eyes met, and something tender passed between them, unspoken, but present. A week later, Mara stayed late to help with a new recipe. One Thomas had been too nervous to try on his own. Walnut honey rolls. They burnt the first batch, laughed at the second. The third? Perfect. He handed her one while it was still warm, their fingers brushing. And Mara, with a quiet smile, said, "If you keep baking like this, I might never leave." Thomas didn't joke this time. "I hope you don't." That night, as Mara walked home under a sky full of stars, she realized her heart felt different. Not healed. Not yet. But no longer starving. Something was rising in her. And for once, it wasn't fear. Not all warmth comes from fire. Some comes from the steadiness of days spent in quiet company, from shared silences that mean more than rushed words. And in Dry Hollow, Mara and Thomas had built something fragile but real, loaf by loaf, glance by glance. But just as bread can burn if forgotten, so can peace. And peace, like fire, can be stolen with one careless spark. It began with a knock. Sheriff Turner stood at the bakery door one chilly morning, hat in hand, eyes apologetic. "Morning, Thomas." "Mara," he nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Need a word. Private." Thomas stepped forward, protective. "She didn't do anything, Sheriff." "It ain't that kind of call," the sheriff said. "It's about Robert's brother, Elijah." Mara froze. Elijah had left town after Robert's death, taking with him every ounce of bitterness the family ever spat her way. He'd never liked her. Never believed she'd loved Robert. Always whispered that she was after the family's land, the name, the small inheritance that vanished when Robert died. "What about him?" Mara asked tightly. "He's back. Filed a claim to contest Robert's will. Says you had no right to stay in Dry Hollow, no claim to anything tied to the family. And he's stirring talk, the ugly kind." By the end of that week, business slowed. Folks who once bought biscuits turned cold. Mrs. Whitley made her opinion public, declaring Mara a troublemaker who had always tempted trouble. The town didn't throw stones, but it did what it always did. It turned its face. Mara tried to keep working, but her hands shook as she kneaded. She flinched when the doorbell rang. The smile she wore began to crack at the corners. One evening, Thomas found her staring into the brick oven long after the last loaf had cooled. "I should go," she whispered, "before people stop coming altogether." Thomas took a breath, then shook his head. "No, I don't want to ruin your business." "You're not ruining it. They are." She looked at him, hurt. "They're just being who they've always been." "And I'm not," he said. "Not anymore." He crossed to her, took her flour-dusted hand in his. "I lost someone once. My wife. She was gentle and quiet, and the world was kinder to her than it's been to you. But she still faded. I watched it happen." He swallowed. "But you fight back just by standing, just by baking, by staying, by choosing not to run." Mara blinked. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then let me stand beside you when the next storm comes." That night, Thomas left a new sign hanging above the bakery door. "Fresh bread, fresh starts, all are welcome." The message was simple, but in a town that clung to old grudges, it was bold. And beside the fire, the dough still rose. The next few weeks were quieter. Not empty, just quieter. A few loyal customers still came by. Old Mr. Thatcher, who didn't care for gossip, young Ruthie, who loved Mara's jam tarts, and one or two ranch hands who only cared whether the bread was warm and cheap. But for the most part, the town watched and waited. Waited to see if Mara would break again. Waited to see if Thomas would ask her to leave. But neither happened. Instead, they adapted. Mara began waking earlier, kneading quietly while the moon still hung in the sky. Thomas started offering pay-what-you-can baskets near the door. No questions asked. And each evening, when the shutters were drawn and the last crumbs brushed away, they sat together, sometimes speaking, sometimes not, bound by something stronger than words. One night, rain pelted the roof so hard they had to shout to hear each other. Thomas sat by the fire, polishing a tray, while Mara stared out at the blurred town. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Letting me in," he chuckled. "I regret not doing it sooner." She turned. "You really mean that?" He looked up, eyes steady. "You came in with dust on your shoes and scars you didn't bother hiding. And somehow you made this place warmer." Her throat tightened. "I've been a ghost for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen." Thomas stood, walking slowly to where she sat. "I see you. Not what they say. Not who they think you were. You." Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, Mara whispered, "I'm scared, Thomas." He nodded. "Me too. Of what comes next. Of what doesn't." He reached for her hand. Not to pull her close, just to let it rest there. Still. Honest. And she didn't let go. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving muddy tracks and clear skies. Mara stepped outside to sweep the porch and found a single loaf sitting on the step, wrapped in a worn cloth. No note. Just a quiet gesture. A neighbor's silent way of saying, I see you too. That was how healing began. Not in grand gestures or sudden forgiveness, but in small, soft acts. A loaf on a step, a hand not letting go. A fire kept burning even when the world grew cold. Spring came early that year. The trees behind Dry Hollow bloomed with stubborn color, and the winds began to carry something sweeter. Hope, maybe. Or the faint scent of rising dough from Hale's bakery, where the window stayed cracked just enough to tempt passers-by. Inside, the rhythm of the bakery felt stronger than ever. Mara now moved with quiet confidence, measuring flour by touch, judging oven heat with a glance, and smiling more often, especially when Thomas handed her a cooling rack like it was the most important job in the world. "You ever think about what's next?" Thomas asked one afternoon as they shaped dough in silence. Mara arched a brow. "You mean besides biscuits?" He smiled. "No, I mean for you, your life." She paused, wiped her hands on her apron. "I used to think there wouldn't be anything after, that my story ended when I lost Robert, or when Elijah came back, but now—" She glanced at him. "Now I wonder if maybe this here is what was waiting for me all along." Thomas looked at her carefully. "And if it was?" Mara laughed quietly. "Then I'd ask the man who bakes my favorite rolls if he plans to keep me around." That night, after they closed, Thomas didn't go straight to cleaning the counter. Instead, he pulled out a small tin box from beneath the cupboard. Inside, a silver thimble, a faded photograph of a young boy in a cap and something else, wrapped in a cloth napkin. He held it in his hands for a long time. The next morning, Mara found a note folded neatly next to a warm loaf on her windowsill. It read, "If this is the chapter where your story begins again, would you let me be part of it? T." She read it twice, then smiled. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine forever. Not as something distant or scary, but as something possible. Later that day, Mara stood at the bakery window as Thomas rolled dough beside her. She nudged his elbow. "So, do you write all your confessions on bread wrappers, or was that just for me?" He smirked. "Only for you." She took his hand, flour and all. "Then here's mine." He turned, eyes searching hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Thomas." Outside, the town still watched. But inside, the oven stayed warm, the loaves still rose. And so did love, in quiet, slow-turning ways that no gossip could undo. Weeks passed. The scent of cinnamon and honey drifted farther across town now. More people came. Not in crowds, but in careful twos and threes. People who once crossed the street now lingered at the bakery window. No one said it aloud, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the way Thomas smiled when Mara handed out fresh biscuits. Maybe it was the way she greeted even the coldest neighbors with grace. Or maybe it was the simple truth. Kindness, like bread, rises best when shared. One Saturday, an elderly man Mara didn't recognize entered the shop just before closing. His clothes were threadbare, his eyes downcast. I don't have much," he said, voice low. "But I heard there's bread here that doesn't ask for more than a man can give." Mara didn't hesitate. She wrapped a warm loaf in cloth, tucked a small jar of apple butter beside it, and placed it gently in his hands. "No charge," she said. "Just pass it on." He looked up, stunned. To who? To anyone who's forgotten what being full feels like. That moment became something more. By word of mouth, Hale's Bakery earned a new name. Loaves for the Lonely. No sign on the door changed. No prices were lowered officially. But people came. Quiet ones, tired ones, people who needed more than food. And they always left with something warm in their hands, and something softer in their hearts. One evening, as the sun dipped low, and the fire in the oven crackled softly, Mara and Thomas sat on the back porch, 2 mugs of tea between them. "Funny how the town didn't change," she said. "But I did." Thomas turned to her. "You didn't change, Mara. You returned." She thought about that. "I think maybe I was always this person, just waiting for someone to see it." Thomas reached over, brushed a curl from her cheek. "I saw it the moment you asked for bread like it was a favor instead of a right." She laughed. "I was starving, and still polite. They didn't kiss then, not because they didn't want to, but because some moments are too sacred to rush. Love, like dough, needs time. And these two had learned how to wait. The bakery had become more than a place to eat. It was where stories began again. Widows brought their grandchildren to buy honey rolls and left with tearful eyes and hope in their hearts. Ranchers, who once sneered, now tipped their hats. Children waited eagerly for the corner scraps Mara always saved by accident. And in the center of it all were 2 people who hadn't asked to be loved, but were learning how to offer it anyway. One morning, Thomas watched Mara from the doorway. She stood at the window counter, bathed in early sunlight, her sleeves dusted in flour. She was humming to herself, a song he didn't recognize but never wanted to forget. He stepped forward, heart thudding harder than it should. "Mara," he said softly. She looked up. "I've been thinking," he began, his hands fidgeting with a linen cloth. "We've been building something here. Quietly. Carefully. Loaf by loaf, and I was wondering—" He hesitated. Her eyes steadied him. "Would you consider making this a partnership? A real one? On paper? In life?" Mara didn't answer at first. She walked to the oven, checked a tray, then returned with a shy smile. "Thomas Hale," she said, setting a warm roll on the table. "Are you proposing with pastry?" His ears turned red. I didn't mean—" "I was hoping you would," she whispered, cutting him off. There was no ring yet, no grand ceremony, just two people who had been broken, then baked back together in slow heat. And that morning, they shared a honey roll in the back of the bakery as if it were wedding cake. Outside, spring melted into early summer. The town didn't stop gossiping, but it softened. People nodded, smiled. Some even apologized in roundabout ways. And the sign above the door stayed the same. Fresh bread, fresh starts, all are welcome. But now, if you looked closely, a second sign had been added below in Thomas's handwriting. "And love is always rising." Summer in Dry Hollow came with golden light and the scent of dust, horses, and wild sage. The days stretched long, and the heat baked the town as surely as Mara and Thomas baked bread in the early morning hours. But despite the sun's weight and the past's shadows, there was joy in the air. Mara and Thomas had quietly begun calling each other partner. At first it was a joke between rising loaves. Then it became the truth. "Partner, did you add too much salt again?" Mara teased one morning. Thomas grinned. "No, just enough to match your sass." She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her lips curled. Their laughter rose with the bread, gentle, constant, healing. One afternoon, while reorganizing the shelves, Mara found a small, aged ledger buried beneath the flour sacks. It was Thomas's old bakery journal. Tucked inside were years of notes, recipes, scribbled calculations, and one folded paper, barely hanging on. She opened it. It was a letter to the woman I haven't met yet. "If you ever find this, if you're here, in this kitchen, I hope you know you were waited for, prayed for, dreamed of in quiet mornings and sleepless nights. If you're reading this, I hope the bread is warm and the seat beside me is yours." Tea? Mara's throat caught. She held the note to her chest and sat down, the flour dust rising like memory. That evening, she didn't say a word about the letter. But when she brought Thomas his tea, she also brought a clean page and set it beside him. "Your turn," she whispered. He looked up, confused. "To write something. For the next woman who walks into this kitchen." Thomas laughed low and warm. "She'll have high expectations." "Then you'd better make the bread perfect." The next morning, the bakery opened with a small bouquet of wildflowers in the window and a new warmth that even strangers felt when they stepped inside. No one could quite explain it, but those who stayed long enough always left feeling a little more full. And in the quiet moments, while the town yawned awake or drifted to sleep, Mara and Thomas worked side by side, not to forget the past, but to build something steadier than pain. A future that smelled like cinnamon, felt like home, and rose like bread in a trusted oven. The late summer winds carried the scent of ripened wheat and cooling nights. Dry Hollow slowed its pace, preparing for harvest, for change. And in a bakery at the edge of Main Street, change was already kneading its way deep. Mara woke each morning with a steadiness she'd never known before. Not born of fear or duty, but of belonging. The walls of the bakery no longer echoed with the silence of survival. They pulsed with quiet joy. Thomas was still the same quiet man. But now, he reached for her hand without hesitation. He smiled faster. He whistled while mixing dough. And each time he glanced at Mara when he thought she wasn't looking, it was the same look a man might give the first sunrise after a long winter. One day, as they cleaned up before closing, Mara asked, "Did you ever think life would look like this?" He paused, wiping a floury hand on his apron. "I didn't think life would look like anything after Grace died. It was all gray, functional, bread and sleep, repeat." "And now?" Thomas looked around the room. The empty shelves, the faint hum of the oven winding down, the chair where she always sat to drink her tea. "Now it's more than just rising dough." He turned to her. "Now it feels like life is rising too." They made it official the next Sunday. No church bells, no fancy clothes, just a closed sign, a dozen friends, and vows exchanged in the golden hour light behind the bakery. Ruthie, the girl who once traded smiles for tarts, tossed wildflowers into the breeze. Old Mr. Thatcher wept into a gingham napkin.
Even Mrs. Whitley sent over a pie, store-bought, of course, but it came with a note. For what it's worth, I was wrong. You made this town better. Both of you. That night, under stars, Mara leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder as they sat behind the bakery, listening to the world exhale. You know, she said, I thought my life was a broken recipe. Too much sorrow, not enough love, nothing that would ever rise again. He slipped his fingers through hers. But you forgot one thing. What? He kissed her hair. Some dough needs to be punched down before it rises stronger. And so they kept baking. Loaves, laughs, love, the kind that fills rooms long after the oven cools. Autumn crept into Dry Hollow gently, like a familiar tune. The leaves turned to flame-colored whispers, drifting down like blessings. The scent of clove, nutmeg, and sweet cornbread filled the streets, most of it trailing from the door of Hale's Bakery. But it wasn't just the changing seasons drawing people in. It was them. Mara had become more than the baker's partner. She was the heart of the place. When customers came in troubled, she gave them tea and a story. When old gossip flared, she responded with kindness so firm it humbled even the harshest tongues. And Thomas? He baked like he was building a home with every loaf, as if the warmth in the crust was meant to wrap around the people who had once turned him away. One afternoon, a stranger stepped through the bakery door. He was tall, sun-worn, and slow-spoken. His eyes lingered too long on Mara, though not with malice, more like memory. Name's Caleb, he said, removing his hat. I knew your husband, Robert. The room chilled, just for a breath. Mara set down her rolling pin. I see. I heard what happened after. I wasn't there, but I never believed the things they said. Not about you. Thomas came to stand quietly beside her. Caleb looked between them, then reached into his coat, pulling out a wrinkled envelope. I promised him I'd bring this to you if anything ever happened. I should have come sooner, but I wasn't sure you'd want to see me. Mara took the letter slowly. It was Robert's handwriting. She knew it before unfolding it. That night, she sat by the fire reading the words of a man who had been part of her hardest years. The letter wasn't long, but it held something powerful. His regret, his hope, and his blessing. Should she ever find someone who treated her better than he had? She cried, quietly, not from grief, from release. Then she handed the letter to Thomas. He hoped I'd find peace. Thomas read it, then folded it with reverence. You didn't find peace, he said softly. You made it. The next day, Mara added a new loaf to the bakery menu. Harvest forgiveness bread. It had cinnamon, clove, and the tiniest hint of rosemary. The first slice went to Caleb, the second to Mrs. Whitley, and the third to herself. Because sometimes, a woman has to taste the sweetness of her own survival, to remember that even the hardest seasons can turn. It was nearly winter again. The winds blew colder now, rattling the windows at night and curling under doors no matter how tightly sealed. But inside Hale's Bakery, warmth held fast. The bread rose. The tea steamed. The fire never truly died down. One evening, just as Thomas was locking up and Mara was washing the last pan, a knock sounded at the back door. Not the front, the back, the one only vendors and neighbors used. Thomas opened it cautiously and found no one there. Just a small basket, wrapped in linen, still warm. Inside, a loaf of Mara's rosemary honey bread, and a note for the ones who taught us it's never too late to be kind. A friend. Mara stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. Her eyes shimmered, and she smiled without speaking. The next morning, they found more. A jar of apple preserves from the widow down the road, a bundle of dried herbs from the school teacher, a tiny wooden carving of a loaf of bread from one of the children. Each came without fanfare, without names, without debt. It was the town's quiet way of saying, we see you now, and we're sorry it took so long. They placed the items on a shelf by the window, called it the Wall of Return, a corner for those who had once turned away, but now stepped forward. Mara left a note there, written in her careful hand. No heart is too late to rise again, M.H. Thomas built a new table near the ovens, where those who couldn't afford bread could sit and share what little they had, stories, silence, or even just warmth. Even loaf by loaf, he told Mara one night, this town is remembering how to love. And she nodded, eyes full of something deep. Not pride, not victory, but peace. Because when you survive bitterness and still choose to sweeten the world around you, that's the truest kind of courage. The first snowfall came early that year. Soft flakes blanketed the rooftops like sifted flour, and the air grew sharp with frost. Dry Hollow quieted beneath the hush of winter, as if the land itself had drawn closer to the fire. But at Hale's Bakery, the warmth only grew. Mara woke before dawn, as always, but now she had company. Thomas was usually already up,
waiting at the stove with 2 mugs of tea and a smile that had become her favorite way to start the day. Together they moved like dancers in rhythm, mixing, kneading, laughing, brushing shoulders as cinnamon sugar spirals cooled on trays. One morning, a young mother came in carrying a bundled infant, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I heard this place feeds more than hunger," she said. Mara handed her a warm biscuit and a blanket without a word. Later, they added another chair to the wall of return, this one smaller, painted blue by the children in town, for families who needed a start. Christmas was approaching. Thomas and Mara didn't decorate extravagantly. Just a string of lights, a wreath on the door, and a little sign that read, "Come in from the cold. No heart too heavy, no hand unwelcome." That Christmas Eve, they hosted a dinner. They called it the winter table. No invitations, no price, just bread, soup, and whatever the neighbors brought. And they came, the widow, the school teacher, Caleb, even Mrs. Whitley, who brought a shaky-lipped apology and a surprisingly good pecan pie. People filled the little shop shoulder to shoulder, stories rising with the steam from the soup. Mara stood behind the counter watching it all. Thomas came up behind her and placed his hand on hers. "This is yours," he said. She shook her head gently. "Ours." Later, as snow fell softly and lanterns dimmed, the guests drifted home, warmer than when they came. Thomas and Mara remained, sitting in the stillness. He handed her a box. Inside, a ring, silver and simple, shaped like a braided rope. "No vows," he said. "Just this. I'll stand beside you every sunrise we're given." Mara didn't cry. She only took the ring, slid it on, and whispered, "Then we rise together." Outside, the town slept, but inside the bakery, the fire glowed. And love, like bread, continued to rise. Winter deepened across Dry Hollow. The snow grew thicker. Nights stretched longer. Yet the heart of the town beat steady, warm and fragrant from the tiny bakery that refused to let people forget what kindness tasted like. The wall of return had grown. Dozens of gifts now filled its shelf. Dried flowers, stitched handkerchiefs, bundles of firewood, letters left by those who once turned away. Some letters were long and teary, others were barely a line. "You fed me before I believed I deserved it. You taught me that warm hands can make a cold day bearable. I judged. You baked. You won." Mara read them all. Thomas saved every one. One morning in January, a group of children appeared at the door with their teacher, holding up a sign made of patchwork cloth. "Thank you for feeding our hearts." They sang a simple song, voices high and imperfect, but full of warmth. Thomas had to excuse himself halfway through. Mara didn't bother hiding her tears. Later that day, Thomas added something new to the chalkboard menu. Special of the day. Mercy served warm. Someone asked if it was a soup. He winked. "It's whatever you need it to be." That night, Mara and Thomas sat together by the fire, the bakery finally quiet. "You ever think this place is magic?" she asked softly. Thomas didn't answer right away. He gazed around at the tiny kitchen, the soft clink of pans, the ever-present scent of rising dough. "No," he said at last. "I think you're the magic. The bread just gave people an excuse to come see it." Mara leaned against him. "And you?" "I just made sure the oven stayed lit." Outside, the snow fell again. But inside, the oven still burned. And as long as it did, Hale's Bakery would remain what it had always quietly become, a place where love was needed daily, hope was served in slices, and no one was ever truly alone. The seasons circled once more. Spring pushed her green fingers through the melting snow, and with it came new beginnings, not just for the town, but for the bakery, for Mara and Thomas, and for those who still wandered in with nothing more than empty hands and tired eyes. One Saturday morning, Thomas caught Mara standing in front of the mirror behind the pantry door. She was frowning. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. She sighed. "Gray hairs, wrinkles, I'm starting to look like someone's grandmother." He chuckled. "That's odd. I was just thinking you look like the woman I fell for. Flower in her hair, fire in her eyes." She rolled her eyes, but her smile stayed. "Flatterer?" "No," he said, pulling her into his arms. "Honest man with a good view." That afternoon, a young woman wandered into the bakery with a baby on her hip and desperation in her gaze. She looked almost like Mara had, once upon a time. "I don't have money," she whispered, "but my daughter's hungry." Mara didn't hesitate. She filled a small basket. A honey roll, a boiled egg, a jar of sweet butter. "Sit. Rest," she said. "You're not the first to come through these doors carrying more weight than you should." Thomas brought over a clean baby blanket, still warm from the laundry. He didn't speak, just smiled, the same way he had the first time he saw Mara. After the girl left, Mara stood at the doorway watching her disappear into the afternoon light. Thomas joined her. "She'll be back," he said. "I hope so. You gave her more than food." She nodded, voice quiet. "Because someone once did that for me." That night, Mara wrote a new line on the bakery's chalkboard sign.
The door you walk through might change your life. And it did again and again. With every loaf, every gesture, every second chance, Hale's Bakery reminded the town and its own keepers that love isn't loud. It's slow, it's steady, it's in the flower in your hair and the hand that never lets go. The sun returned to Dry Hollow with a golden vengeance, warming the rooftops and waking the wildflowers in the hills. At Hale's Bakery, the air was thick with rising dough, wild honey, and the quiet joy of a life rebuilt. But this time, something new stirred. It started with a letter. Mara found it tucked under the front door one morning, sealed in faded wax. It was from the County Fair Committee. Thomas read it aloud. We'd be honored if Hale's Bakery would join the Harvest Festival this year. Your bread has done more than feed bellies. It's brought dignity, peace, and unity. We'd love for you to share that story with the county. Mara stared at the letter like it was written in another language. Us? A festival? Thomas smiled. They want our story. She frowned. We don't have a story. He touched her hand. Mara, we are the story. They hesitated at first, but with encouragement from neighbors and a little pushing from the schoolteacher, they agreed, and so began the preparation. They designed a small booth. Mara chose her signature breads. Thomas carved a wooden sign. Loaf by loaf, a love story. The day of the fair was warm, alive with music, laughter, and rows of booths that smelled like sugar and smoke. Their table was simple, just bread, jam, and slices of their story written on recipe cards. Forgiveness bread, second chance sourdough, new dawn loaf. People stopped, tasted, asked questions. Mara told them about the time her only possession was a stale biscuit. Thomas told them how baking saved him from his grief, and both of them told the truth. We didn't rise because we were strong. We rose because someone believed we still could. By sunset, their booth had emptied. Not a crumb left, but their hearts overflowing. That night under the stars, Thomas held Mara close. You changed this town, he whispered. No, she said. We did. He smiled, brushing flour from her cheek. Let's never stop rising. Late summer lingered like a sweet dream over Dry Hollow. The fair had come and gone, but the story of the bakery, their story, stayed behind like the scent of fresh bread in the walls. People still came through the doors. Not just for food, but for something else they couldn't quite name. Mara called it soul warmth. Thomas called it home. One evening, as the sky burned gold, they received another visitor. This time it was a young couple, nervous, holding hands too tightly. We heard this place fixes broken hearts, the man said, chuckling awkwardly. Mara raised an eyebrow. We serve pie, not magic. But you two, the woman added, you remind people that good still exists. Thomas motioned to the chairs by the fire. Sit a while, the tea's free. They stayed late, sharing quiet tears and gentle laughter. Before leaving, the woman pressed a small paper into Mara's hand. A drawing. It showed a simple oven, glowing, with two people inside baking bread together, surrounded by hearts and stars. On the back, we didn't have a place to turn, but now we know one exists. Later that night, as the fire dimmed, Mara stared at the drawing. You think people come for the bread? She asked. Thomas shook his head. They come for you. The bread's just what lets them stay. She leaned into him, her voice soft. Promise me something? Anything. If we ever forget what this place is about, bring me back here. To the first loaf, to the quiet mornings, to the ache and the healing. He kissed her temple gently. I'll never let us forget. Outside, the winds were beginning to whisper of fall again. But inside Hale's Bakery, love still rose, still baked, still wrapped its warmth around anyone who entered. And in that glow, Mara and Thomas knew, some things cool over time, but what's made with love stays warm forever. Years had passed. Dry Hollow had changed. New families moved in, old ones left footprints behind, and the bakery, it remained. Like an anchor, like a light, like a promise. The paint on the bakery sign had faded a bit. The hearth crackled a little slower in winter, but every morning the smell of fresh bread still drifted down Main Street, and every evening the light stayed on until the last soul who needed comfort had their fill. Mara now had streaks of silver in her dark hair. Thomas walked a little slower, took longer to tie his apron, but their eyes still the same, still bright, still burning. On the bakery's 20th anniversary, the town gathered, not because there was a sale, not because of coupons or flyers. They came because the bakery had become something more than a place to buy food. It had become a part of them. Children who once sat at the counter now came with children of their own. Ruthie, now grown, baked pies and called Mara Mama. Caleb visited every year with his dog and quiet thanks. Even Mrs. Whitley, now frail and softer in spirit, sat near the fire and helped roll dough with her trembling hands. That night, After the crowd faded and the last dish was washed, Thomas reached into the back room and pulled out a small box.
Mara looked puzzled.
He opened it. Inside, a tiny wrapped loaf, a simple one, just honey and wheat.
I saved it, he said. From the first month you moved in. I kept it in the freezer all these years. Figured if we ever forgot why we started, we could break it open together. Mara's eyes brimmed with quiet emotion.
You think it's still good?
Thomas smiled. Only one way to find out. They sliced the loaf. It was dense, a little dry. But as they chewed, the memory returned. The fear, the hope, the beginning. And it tasted like everything that mattered. That night, they sat outside under a sky full of stars, fingers entwined. Mara rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. You think the town will remember us? He looked toward the glowing windows of their little bakery. Still warm, still alive. No, he whispered. They'll remember what we made them feel. And long after their hands no longer kneaded dough, after the door creaked open for the last time, after the fire burned its final ember, the scent of love, yeasty, honeyed, rising slow, remained in the air. Because some stories aren't written in pages. They're written in loaves, in hands held, in second chances, in the warmth we leave behind.